bit of time for Q&A before we break for lunch. I know there's a few people who have snuck out of the room for my stretching break. That's okay. If we can just make our way back to your chairs, that'd be great. So to finish off the talk, this session this morning, I'm actually now going to jump more into the sciences. So the talk title I've written up today is Refuting Evolution. So how a biblical worldview makes more sense of what we see. While everyone's still milling a little bit, we can actually I want to do a little bit of a snap poll. This will also get your arms moving. And just to see maybe some of the things that you have talked or heard about, maybe other people share the same thing. So if you have heard this or maybe have been asked this, do you want to just raise your hand and keep it up for me? You won't have to keep it up for long, just so we can have a bit of a snap poll. So has anyone here, if you were taught evolution is a scientific truth, whether it's at school or university? A few, yep. Has anyone been told that you can see evolution happening right now? So therefore, we all must have evolved. I know I got taught that at university. What about the idea that given enough time, small changes will lead to new species, and so therefore evolution must be true? I definitely got taught that at school and at university. Okay. So the concept of evolution, whether it be what I'm talking here about biological evolution, so the idea that we evolve from an ape-like creature, or just generally this idea of what Dr. Conn would say deep time, of eons of time, is sort of a cosmological evolution or a geological evolution. This idea is something that, whether we actually realize it or not, we're all exposed to in our everyday life, because we encounter it, whether it be at school or at university. We definitely encounter it when we watch TV and movies, this idea of millions of years or billions of years, especially if you watch anything like any of the Marvel series, multi-universes. All these concepts come through in our TV shows, in our movies. When you visit museums and you read all their signage, you might see it when you go to the dinosaur section. This dinosaur roamed the earth 100 million years ago. It's that idea of millions of years slowly creeping into our way of thinking. I know definitely in Australia, when I go for a walk in a national park or to a scenic area, the signs there will say this landscape formed this way slowly over this many millions of years. So it's actually, this deep time is actually a really hard thing to ignore, because it comes about in every part of our life. When we watch the news, when we read something, an article online, often it talks something just put in there as being a fact of millions of years ago. So even though you may not have gone to university and had formal training in biological evolution, this idea of evolution is all around us. And sometimes we just don't pick it up because we're so used to hearing it. And oftentimes it's presented as, well, this is science. This is factual. But I want to run through what actually is science, and Dr. Conn briefly touched on this idea of there's two very distinct types of science. And I know Dr. Conn covered this, but I just want to go into a little bit more detail, because I think this is something that we need to get our heads around, so in the future when we hear the word science, we actually understand what they mean. There's a very big difference between observational science and historical science. Because observational science is something that, this is the one that most people understand because it's what we're exposed to in our schooling and most of the time in our undergraduate classes in university. So observational science, as Dr. Conn has said, it's done in the present. It's observable and it's repeatable. So an example of that would be if you're in a chemistry class. So say you're in a chemistry classroom and I gave everyone here the same set of chemicals and the same set of glassware and the same instructions to carry out an experiment to do a reaction. And if everyone was a very, very good student and followed the instructions, will everyone here get the same result? Yes? So this is observable. You're doing it in the present right now. And it's repeatable because everyone here can do the same experiment and you can check that you're getting the same results. And this is what we think of when we hear about science. We think it's reliable, it's repeatable, it's testable. But when we talk and when we hear about the idea of evolution, as Dr. Conn has said, it's not this type of science. We're talking about historical science. Historical science is when you have some piece of data in front of you. So you have gathered some evidence you can see in the present. But historical science is when you then make up an interpretation of what happened in the past based on this small amount of evidence in front of you right now. Historical science is looking at something that happened in the past, and if it's in the past, it means you can't observe it. It's a one-off. So let me give you an example. So say you have this idea that land-walking dinosaurs slowly changed over millions of years due to natural selection and mutations, and they changed into flying birds. So that's something that scientists, and you'll read that in museums when you look at dinosaurs, they'll make this claim. Land-walking dinosaurs changed into birds. Can you design an experiment to see if that actually happened? No. Can you actually observe it happening now? No. Can you make it repeatable and do it? No. This is historical science. Can you start to see the difference between that and observational science? So whenever you hear something about evolution, it's actually someone's interpretation. It's what they've made up in here. And what they come up with that idea is based on their worldview. As Dr. Conn explained, your worldview is the glasses that you wear and how you see the world. Whether you have a biblical worldview or whether you have an atheistic evolutionary worldview. And I think the problem we have today in our view of science is that whenever we hear something on television or in the news talking about, well, scientists have found X, Y, Z, we think they're doing observational science, true science, when often they're doing this type of science. It's historical science. So example is if you watch any of the nature documentaries, say with David Attenborough, everyone sort of is familiar with his documentaries, beautiful imagery to watch. But what he'll say is, say there's a beautiful image and video of a hummingbird. And he'll say, look at this amazing hummingbird in its design, how it can fly, all of its features. Is that observational science or historical science? Observational. But then he will say in the next sentence, and see how this evolved these features over millions of years. Is that observational science or historical science? Historical. See how they blend these two together? And then they say it's all just science. And so I really want to stress this point of there's two very distinct types of science. There's observational science that we can test, and there's historical science, which is untestable. It's just someone's interpretation of what happened in the past. So let's have a look at this idea of evolution. So what is evolution? Well, the theory of evolution states by natural selection, says that all living creatures are related by descent from common ancestors. And this diversity of life is a product of modifications of populations by mutations and natural selections. So evolution requires two things for it to work. It requires mutations and natural selection. Now, our DNA is the thing that has all the information about how we're put together. So the DNA in you is going to tell you, like for me, why I'm only 5'2" and all my siblings are very tall. My siblings just say I'm the runt of the litter because I'm the youngest, so I'm the short one. But that's in my DNA. It's the instruction manual of how I got put together. So the instruction manual of all living things is held, the information is held in their DNA. So this idea of evolution, that we came from one single-celled microorganism, and slowly over time, evolution occurred to get to a human being. But you have to ask the question, there's a lot of information in a human being, and there's less information in a microbe. How did we get all of that? You see, the simplest known living organism has like 482 protein coding genes. If you're going to write down that cell's all of its DNA information, all of the letters of the genome, if you're going to write all of that down, it would take a large book to hold all of that assembly information of a microorganism. But for a human being, if you're going to write out all of our genetic code, it would take around 1,000 books to write all of that down. So for evolution to be true, we've had to go from one book of genetic information to 1,000 books of genetic information in a human being. So how do they do that? What's the idea? So evolution requires something called mutations for this to happen. That's their explanation. Mutations are the accidental random insertion of these extra DNA letters into our genetic code. Because you have to go from one book to 1,000 books. You have to have a lot of extra information. But the problem that evolution has is that through observational science, we know that the majority of mutations that we see are damaging to an organism. They're actually not beneficial. And mutations, they don't add the type of genetic information required for evolution. What I mean by that is you can't just add extra information. So my slideshow here that you're watching contains lots of information. If I just copied the slideshow and pasted it back into itself, so made going from 42 slides, copied them, so now my slideshow would be 84 slides. I've doubled the amount of slides, but I haven't made any new information. It's just going to be a really extra long presentation with the same amount of information doubled. And that's what I mean by that last point. Mutations, they don't add the type of genetic information. There's no point just doubling the same information. To go from a microbe to a human being, you have to add new information, like lungs, how to make fingers, how to make eyes. That's all new information that a microbe doesn't currently have. So you can't just add the same information twice. You have to create new genetic information. And observational science tells us that that's not happening today. So what's the other thing that evolution requires for it to work? And that's what they call natural selection. So natural selection is a concept, well, it's been tested, so we have variation of traits that already exist within a population. So take us in this room, for example. if you all lined us up from height, you would see that we're not all the same height. We have variation in how tall we are. Particularly if I stand next to Dr. Con, you can see that there's a variation within this population of human beings in this room. If we looked at skin colour, we'd see that there's variation in our skin colour in this room. If we looked at how well our eyes work, you see there's variation in this room with how well our eyes work. So natural selection has this idea that there's traits that already exist within a population. But natural selection says that there's certain traits become beneficial to survival in a population. So if a certain trait is more beneficial, say for example, being tall meant you could reach more food sources, I could be in trouble. And maybe I'd be in enough trouble that I wouldn't be able to have any children, I couldn't pass on my short genes to them, and so the population would look different because everyone now would be tall, because only the tall people would be able to get food. It's this idea that a trait is beneficial to your survival. And so a population will actually change how it looks over time based on these traits. So I'm going to give you an example here of some puppy dogs to get this idea across to you. So in this example, we have two dogs, and we're going to talk about their hair length. And it's a very scientific drawing, as you can see. So the little things on their chest is the genes for hair length. So we all know we get we get one set of genes from our mum, and we get one set of genes from our dad. So we have there two what we call alleles. And you can see with these dogs, they both have a short hair gene, which has nothing hanging off it, and they have a long hair gene. Again, it's a very scientific drawing. It has lots of little fuzzy things off it to show long hair. And so because they have a short hair gene from mum and a long hair gene from dad, they have medium hair length. So if we have two dogs that fall in love and get married and have puppies, one of their puppies can inherit one short-haired gene from their mum and one short-haired gene from their dad, and that's going to be a short-haired dog. They can have other children who get one short-haired gene from mum, they get a long-haired gene from dad, or vice versa, and they're going to look exactly like mum and dad. They're going to have medium hair length. But they might have one puppy that gets a long-haired gene from mum and a long-haired gene from dad, and they're going to be chaos if they get into your house and have carpet, because you're going to have like long hair everywhere. So this is what we talk about. There's variation in the population. There's variation in hair length. But what happens when there's an environmental pressure? So evolution will say when there's an environmental pressure on a population, that's going to cause an effect. So say all of a sudden there's a very cold shift. You know, they've had to move from Penang to Antarctica. It's not going to be good news for the short and medium hair length dogs. So if the climate changed, say for example, and it got very, very cold, having long hair is now a beneficial trait. They're going to be able to survive as opposed to the short-haired dogs. So now if we have that long-haired dog, and this is where I don't use like actual pictures of puppy dogs, because everyone would now be in tears because the dogs have died. But what if just the two long-haired dog, he finds another long-haired dog, they fall in love and get married. If they have puppy dogs, one of them could have this. They're going to get two long-haired genes. If they have more puppies, what are they going to look like? What hair length are they going to have? Long? They actually can only have long hair because the short hair gene has been removed from the population. And this is the problem that evolution has with natural selection. You see, natural selection reduces information. So you can see from the diagram that short-haired gene has been lost from the population. This population can no longer produce medium or short-haired dogs because the gene has gone from the genome. Natural selection reduces genetic information. What does evolution require to go from a microbe to a human being? More genetic information. So natural selection actually works against evolution. It's not a creative process at all. So, does natural selection happen? Well, yes. We can actually see it happening. It's actually observational science. You see, we actually do it artificially. We breed dogs to have certain traits. We can breed dogs to be very big and have them like German Shepherds, or we can breed dogs to make Chihuahuas, and it's still a dog. That's all the same species. They're just different traits being expressed. It's experimental observational science. But did natural selection lead to evolution? Well, that's historical science. That's just someone's interpretation. But the problem we have in many educational settings is that they'll explain natural selection, and we can see natural selection happening, but then they do, at the end, they say, well, this is evolution. But natural selection and evolution are not the same thing. Evolution requires an increase in genetic information, but natural selection decreases genetic information. In education settings, they tend to blend these concepts together. And I think this is where a lot of young people have a problem in going, but I can see evolution happening. I've been taught it in school. They've shown me lots of examples of natural selection happening. Isn't that evolution? No, the two are very, very different things. So these are the problems with the theory of evolution, is that mutations, we've shown, cause harm. No matter how much we watch Marvel and X-Men, they don't give superpowers. Natural selection is not a creative process. And in fact, the more we discover about microbiology, the worse it gets for evolution. So if you have a look up on the screen here, out of these 5 pictures, when I go through them, I'm going to ask the question actually, which of the 5 do you think is the most sophisticated and complex there? So this is going to be interactive. So hands up if you think a laptop out of all of those is the most sophisticated and complex. None for laptop? An earthworm? 1, 2, oh, everyone's see. Now we're getting game. Few, okay, fair few for earthworm. A space shuttle? Yep, couple, yep. A submarine? Oh, the submarine has no friends. A house? None for a house. The most sophisticated and complex on that screen is an earthworm. Well done for earthworm people. Actually, if I had put just a single cell from your body on that screen, that would have been the most complex thing on that screen. Not an entire organism, just a single cell from your body. Because a single cell is actually more complex than a modern city, which is crazy to think about. But this is because in a single cell, there are thousands of different proteins, molecules, organelles, all working together in a coordinated manner. And inside every single cell that you have, it continuously is adapting, replicating, it's undergoing chemical reactions. If conditions in the room change, it will change what it's doing for you. Unlike a static city structure. And by that I mean, if you look at Penang and you think about its road infrastructure, electricity, all of those things that are actually just static. Nothing's happening to them. They've all been built and they're staying in place. A cell is continuously adapting to its environment around it. It's amazing. And this is the problem we have for evolution. Because even inside a single cell, you have this question of, well, what came first? So bear with me as I go through this. So I said before, our DNA has all the instructions that put us together, tells us how everything works and operates. But DNA is very complex. It's actually a language in itself. It's a code. So in order for your cell to actually understand what is written in your DNA, it has to be decoded. And this happens by something called a ribosome. It actually decodes the language of the DNA to read DNA. But the problem is that the instructions to make the ribosomes are in the DNA. But the ribosomes have to decode the DNA. It gets worse. Ribosomes need energy to actually work. And they get their energy from something called ATP. I'm not going to go into all the science, but it's like their food for them is something called ATP, energy. This energy is made by it's an organic motor. It's the most efficient motor that they've ever discovered in the world. It's actually an organic motor called ATP synthase. So ATP synthase makes the energy. But again, the instructions on how to make the ATP synthase is in the DNA, but the ribosomes need to translate the DNA, but the message for the DNA is in the ribosomes, but the ribosomes need energy first, but the instruction manual for the ATP is in the... Can you see how it's... The only way for this to come about is that it all has to be built at once. You can't have DNA by itself without ATP, and you can't have ATP without DNA and ribosomes. Everything here has to have come about at once, working in a system. You can't have evolution happening where maybe DNA came about and then maybe sometime later ATP just came about through non-living organisms. It has to all come about at once. And what is it that we actually see happening? This is what we see happening in the world around us. And it's what Genesis 1:24 actually states. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creature after his kind, cattle and creeping thing, and beast of the earth after his kind," and it was so. This is what we see today. Dogs giving birth to dogs, cats giving birth to cats, human beings giving birth to human beings. This is what we actually see. And it's what we actually see in terms of biology, in terms of genetics. The complexity of the cell, we see that everything actually had to come about all at once. It can't have slowly evolved over time. And the recent discoveries that we've made in genetics is even more amazing. So in the last 20 or so years, geneticists have done a lot of work looking at our genetic heritage. How can we trace back our genetics worldwide? And they did this through something called mitochondrial DNA. Now, mitochondrial DNA is a little part of DNA that's only passed on by mothers to their children. It's not passed on by fathers. So they can trace a lot of this heritage through your maternal line. And it's really interesting that secular scientists doing this work, one of their major findings, they actually called it mitochondrial Eve. And the reason they called it this was because they discovered that the human population can trace all of their ancestry back to a single female. And what do we read in the book of Genesis? Adam named his wife Eve because she was the mother of all living. And I just find it really interesting that secular scientists making this discovery that we can trace all of our genetic heritage back to one single female they decided to call this mitochondrial Eve after the Bible. So for a long time, scientists were telling us that our creation narrative in Genesis can't be true. But our modern genetics has made a discovery, and the discovery that they made was that in fact all human beings are descended from one human female, as described in the book of Genesis. The other discovery that they've made was that through, again, genetics, is that human beings underwent what they call a population bottleneck. So picture a bottle, and it's literally a bottleneck, meaning there was a larger population, and for some reason that population got reduced to a very small number before then it enlarged again. Now, where can we read in the book of Genesis a large population of human beings being reduced significantly to just a few before then blossoming again? Anyone? Noah's flood. So again, for a long time, we were told there can't have been a flood that wiped out humans to only this few people. Surely that could have happened because we didn't understand genetics back then like we do now. But we have discovered recently with genetics that the human population underwent a significant bottleneck at some point in history. And the other thing they've discovered is that the human population dispersed from a single location, they believe now. And so, again, from their genetic discoveries, originally they had this idea that humans dispersed from different parts of Africa, and there was multiple different waves of migration of human beings. But again, through genetic discoveries, they've now revised that and said, no, human beings actually dispersed from one single source before we spread across the earth. And again, if we look back to the book of Genesis, the account of the Tower of Babel describes the dispersion of human beings. So the more that we learn about genetics in science, the more science is continuing to return to the Bible and saying, actually, the thing that Christians and Jews have held up for so long as being true, the scientific discoveries are continuing to point back to this, which I just find being incredible. But what if we ignore God's word? What if, as Dr. Con was saying, we have these ideas creep into our church teaching about long ages, about trying to fit the evolutionary model into the Genesis narrative? And so Dr. Con has gone through this idea of, well, we would have this picture of the Garden of Eden and it would look perfect. But if there was death before Adam, if we had a microbe slowly evolving into an invertebrate, and then millions of years later, it's slowly evolving into a mammal and so on and so on. By the time we get to Adam in the Garden of Eden, as Dr. Con has already showed, that's what the Garden of Eden would actually look like, according to those ideas. And this idea of disease and suffering and death is not God's idea of good, because Jesus came to destroy the last enemy, which is death. And so death could not be present before Adam was created. And God warned us of death entering the world. Because in Genesis 2:17, he said, "But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not eat of it. For in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die." And we see in Genesis 3 that Adam and Eve do in fact eat from this tree. And this is where death entered the world, not beforehand. And Dr. Connor shared from Romans 5:12 already. Paul writes again that this is where death entered the world. And so from the book of Genesis, we have an understanding that this is what our faith is built on. And I touched a little bit on this in my first talk. In that the book of Genesis tells us that we have a creator. that we have a creator God that made the heavens and the earth and all that is in them. And as a creator God, he also then made the law. And he made it very clear to us what was right and what was wrong. But we sinned. We turned against God, thought we could do things our way and not follow God's word. And because God is a righteous God, he will judge us. But God is also a loving God. And as I said, in Genesis, he laid out a plan for our salvation, that he would send a savior that we could be redeemed. But what if we do away with the creator God? What if we ignore Genesis 1 and 2? What if evolution is taken as being truthful and there is no God that created things? If we take out the creator from that, what are we actually left with? Well, nothing. And it's not just Christians who believe this either. Evolution destroys the gospel message. So this is a quote from an American atheist, Frank Neller. And this is what he says. If there never was an Adam and Eve, there never was an original sin. If there never was an original sin, there is no need of salvation. If there's no need of salvation, there is no need of a savior. And he says, and I submit that puts Jesus, historical or otherwise, into the ranks of the unemployed. He says, I think that evolution is absolutely the death knell of Christianity. Now, his logic is impeccable, but his starting assumption is wrong. And therefore, he's wrong. The book of Genesis tells us so many things that are important to our Christian faith. But the most importantly, it tells us about our relationship with God. That we are made in God's image, we are loved by God, we are fearfully and wonderfully made. And I think this is probably the most dangerous thing about doubting God's word, is that we forget who we are. And I think we see that in today's society of people who don't have a plan, who don't feel they have a purpose, and it's because of these different worldviews. Atheism versus Christianity. The fruits that we see from atheism, things like racism, abortion, euthanasia, all come about because they're based on man's truth. Whereas Christianity, and evolution, Christianity provides a worldview where we understand that we are one human family, that we have a loving God, we have the sanctity of life. And all of this is based on the Bible. But evolution presents this idea that life came about by accident, by random processes. And so we can see in the world that doesn't have the Bible as their truth, one where they believe that they are from nothing, that they are nothing, and that they mean nothing. We see so much hopelessness in the world because of this worldview, that they don't have a plan, they feel they have no purpose, because that is what evolution teaches. But it's very different to what the Bible teaches us. The Bible teaches us that we are children of God, that we have a plan, that we have a purpose, that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. And this is why a biblical worldview is so important, to understand who we are and why we are here. So I think I'm going to finish up with, if you haven't had a chance to sign up for the info bites, I'll leave that up. And I think we might be doing Q&A before a break. Yep. want us to stand up, or how would you like to?
Yes. All right, so thank you, Mrs. Neller and Dr. Khan, for your presentations. So right now, let's move over to a time of Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. I think I'll pass around. I think a microphone will be passed around. And we have our speakers here to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, both speakers. That was really, really interesting and thought-provoking. Like you said, we are fearfully and wonderfully made, or the Bible says that. And that always amazed me that, like we are created, all of us, with 2 eyes, 1 nose, and mouth, quite similar, and yet we all look so different. So that always amazes me, really, and that's how we were created. It's, the wonderful works of God, isn't it? Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to ask a question. You mentioned that the bottleneck, just now, population bottleneck. Can you explain a bit more of the preferred discoveries or whatever that come to that conclusion?
So how they got to that conclusion, or?
Yeah. How, whether there are evidence or what from your scientific, periodicals or whatever, that say there's a large population before the flood. I mean, from the Bible we know there's a big population before the flood. How does the education or whatever, community view it and record it, so that I don't know. We read from scriptures that, of course there are a lot of it's a huge population before the flood, and then it was wiped out. So what are the evidence? I just asked for it. Ask you to present the sources or whatever. Thank you.
So the modern genetics, why they have concluded the population bottleneck is they actually look at the male Y chromosome. So if you're a female, you have an X and an X chromosome. And if you're a male, you have an XY chromosome. So the Y is inherited from your father. And so that's how only males have a Y chromosome. So the genetics, they actually looked at the Y chromosome, and what they discovered was that there's very minimal change in the Y chromosome around the world population. And so they were actually looking at the changes of the Y chromosome throughout the world, and then looking at the mutations that have occurred on that chromosome and tracing it back to know that there was a population bottleneck. So that was one of the major discoveries that the geneticists were looking at, was looking at the actual mutation rate on the Y chromosome in males. And so we know from Noah's Ark that how many men were on the Ark? 4. So Noah and his 3 sons. So how many Y chromosomes were on the Ark? 1. Because Noah passed on his Y chromosome to his 3 sons. And so this is the population bottleneck that they come to. So the genetics is very interesting in terms of what they're being able to discover and trace back now. So again, with mitochondrial DNA, they made the discovery of mitochondrial Eve, tracing it back to a single female ancestor. But there are variations, more variations in the mitochondrial DNA, and they believe that this is secular science, believes there's three major strands, three major lineages, I should say, of the female mitochondrial DNA. And they've given them arbitrary letters, 3 different letters. But again, it's interesting of how many female lineages were on Noah's Ark. How many, after Noah's Ark, how many women would have had children? Down here? Say it out loud. Yeah, 3, yep. Because Noah's 3 sons. There's no evidence that Noah and his wife had more children. And so it's interesting, again, modern genetics is pointing back to 3 main lineages for females. And we know from Noah's Ark that there was 3 female lineages off Noah's Ark. But the difference is that secular scientists will put this timeline to be hundreds of thousands of years, and as opposed to us, because in secular science you don't want to point too much to the Bible because it can be very damaging to your career.
The other point about the records is that unfortunately there is no archaeological records or writings that support anything about a big population before Noah's flood. We can't find it because everything is destroyed in the flood. Yeah. The only historical record we can find is through the Bible. And as Julie said, they don't want to go there because they acknowledge that God is true. Evolution is false. Then that is different conclusion. So they will say, no, Genesis 1 to 11 is just some allegorical, some poetic, some picture, some parable. It's not really history for us. Yeah. But actually, historically, it's correct. That's how we get our history from the Tower of Babel until now. Yeah. I think there is maybe a kind of signal for the question around why we look so different, right? We look different because God confused the languages and spread us all out. And the way they spread them out is through the language groups. I think there are 70 language groups given there. From there, of course, there are more, later on. So the language groups disappeared by household, and they intermarry among themselves, and so the gene pool is really narrow, and so they look different. So the Chinese, they went to China, so they look different than the people like Canaan. They went to not Canaan, I think Mizraim. He went to Egypt. So the darker skinned people went to Africa, and the olive skinned people are staying around the Mesopotamian region. And Japheth and his sons went north and became the so-called European ancestry of the Europeans. Yeah. So that's how we look different. And geographical separation gives us the look that is different. The language also play a part as well in that kind of situation. So that's how we derive the different, we call it races, but actually not races. It's just one big human family of one tribe, one big family, but many, many tribes across the world. That's how we look different.
When is the earth created? The first, when? Universe created.
Okay, so you can do forward counting, right? Forward counting or backward counting. Forward counting is what the Jewish calendar used. So if you trace from Adam, because God recorded history through Adam, and he gave a lot of details in Genesis chapter 5 and chapter 11, so they can piece together. So from Adam to about Genesis chapter 11, which is Abraham's time, is about 2,000 years. If you count the genealogy in chapter 5 and chapter 11. From Abraham to Christ, which we have some historical records, secular and also in the Bible, you put them together is about 2,000 years. From Christ to the present is about 2,000 years. So a forward counting of the year from creation is about 6,000 years. Okay? There are over 100 attempts on this biblical chronology. All of them come out to about 6,000 years plus or minus 500 years. That's where the ballpark is. Depending on assumptions they use, some of the assumptions they use, like for example, how do you count the first year of Adam? Do you count 0 or 1? You know, so these are minor differences, plus a synchronization with the civilization. Those probably bring up a little bit more differences, but it's about 6,000 years plus or minus 500 years. So that's forward counting. Then we piece the date that we know, not the Jewish calendar, but the secular calendar based on AD and BC, or BCE and what else? I don't know what I don't know what they use now, but we use BC and AD when we do biblical studies. Then you will go back to creation year about 4,000 BC, about 4,000 BC, so that when Christ was born at 2 BC and 2 or 4 BC, I think depending on the year you take down, there's some debate there as well. Then you switch from BC to AD, BC1 to AD1, then we have 2000, about 2025 right, this year. So it's 80 years. So you put them together, it's about 6,000 years.
Earlier in your presentations, you made a lot of reference to Genesis, and especially the creation account, and even the beginning of the Gospel of John. I think, Dr. Korn, you did talk about this thing called cosmogony, right? And how during the time of Abraham, perhaps they believed in a different creation model. Like I believe they believed the Enuma Elish, something like that. And so how those cosmogonies have implications towards people like us as well, and how do they maybe because some people say that the Enuma Elish is, or at least the biblical creation account, plagiarized because the Enuma Elish is considered much earlier or something like that. Yeah, how would you respond to this statement?
Yeah. So that is the Mesopotamian history. That is the Enuma Elish story. And they also have a flood story there. So you can look at the story and see whether it's true or not true. Like for example, in the flood story that they said there was a flood, but the ark is a cube. Then you know it's wrong, because it's not stable as a cube to withstand the torrent of flood water during Noah's flood. Yeah. It was really a difficult time for Noah and the family, and also the rest of the world. Yeah, they had to decide whether they want to follow God or follow the world. So they followed the world. All of them followed the world except Noah and his 3 sons and family. Now, when you look at history, you don't use secular history to say this is true. You have to use a biblical history. If the secular history doesn't agree with biblical history, then biblical history has to be true, because God only speak through one language for us, which is through the Bible. Yeah. So all those are just conjecture, and there are a lot of people who believe that the Middle East story, the Mesopotamian story, they call it the ancient Near East history, is much more authoritative than the Bible. And that is not true, because God's word is the most authoritative and gave us all the true account of history. So without the Bible, we do not know what is history. Those are corrupted ideas about God, the Enuma Elish history. Those are corrupted history, including the Greek philosophy as well. All corrupted because the cosmogony they have is God marrying gods, but that's not exactly what happened in heaven. God is only one God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. That's what is laid out in the Bible. Yep. Anything else?
I think there's I know Ron does a talk on this, looking at the comparison between Genesis and Mesopotamia history, because there is a claim that Genesis has copied that story. But a lot of that is based on the dates that they get for when the book of Genesis was written. So they put the date for when the book of Genesis was written, like their oldest script that they can find from an archaeological point of view, to be later than the Mesopotamia. So that's where some of that claim has come from. But as Con has pointed out, who is our eyewitness for the book of Genesis? And that is God. And so most of that claim is based on the archaeology of finding the earliest written evidence for the Torah, not for when the Torah claims to have been, like, the creation week to have occurred. A lot of the Hebrew scholars will actually look at that claim and say, from a Hebrew grammar structure point of view, there is no similarity in structure or story between the Genesis account and Mesopotamia. This claim is actually very, very new. And so, which is surprising, because if you think about how long Jewish culture has been here in terms of the Torah for it to be examined, this claim has only come up very, very recently, and it's more from a Christian perspective than a Jewish perspective. So it's actually only a very new claim, and it's mainly based on archaeological evidence. The Hebrews themselves will look at the grammar and say there actually is no link. They're not similar actually at all in the creation story, but it is a claim that is made.
There is a word very important in Hebrew. It's called toldot, yeah, which is translated in English as generation. These are the generation when God created the heavens and the earth. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, the first toldot mentioned. Then in Genesis chapter 5, we also mentioned these are the generations of Adam, which is toldot of Adam. When you look at these two words, it means in the Bible it is based on sephir. Sephir is records. So which means that Adam already written down probably in clay tablets, a very short account of the whole creation. These are the generations of the creation given to Adam. And then the records of the Genesis chapter 5 on all the different names, Adam also recorded down because he's still living during the time. Yeah. So these are clay tablets which are passed on to Noah. Noah took it on board, most likely. This is just piecing information together between the toldot and what Moses could write. And Moses is the one who God directly talked to face, according to some of the scriptures in the Pentateuch. Yeah? So he wrote everything down, compiled it down, and he's got 40 years to check because the accuracy of Genesis, the book of Genesis. If that is not accurate, he would have sorted out with God during the time. So we believe that what Moses written in Genesis, even though Moses appeared in only Exodus chapter 1, yeah, and onwards, that this is a true account God given to him, so he's a compiler of the whole of Genesis, the book of Genesis.
I know sometimes it's difficult to ask a question when you're in an audience, so if you prefer, you might be able to write your piece of question down on a piece of paper and give it to our wonderful MC, and we might be able to answer it in the next session, because I know sometimes it can be a bit daunting putting your hand up. So if you'd like to write a question down and hand it in, and we can get to your question in the next Q&A round. So that's okay to do that as well. So maybe over lunch, if you think of something as well, write it down and we can address it in our next session.
All right, so thank you, Mrs. Neller and Dr. Khan. So right now we'll head over to a time of lunch.